As France became liberated from German occupation during the Second World War, there was a huge amount of vengeance inflicted upon the population by the French resistance. They were brutal and ruthless with their enemies, as they had been put to the sword themselves. As the Allies liberated different towns and cities, they saw huge public spectacles of punishment, in which women were dragged to town squares and they were forced to undergo the ugly carnival, a shocking event in which women had their heads shaved and they were then forced to run through the crowds who wanted to beat and batter them. But inside of different towns, there were enemies of the resistance who were gathered, and they were then shot by the firing squads of the French resistance. In October 1944, in a small town, there was a French collaborator who was executed in front of a large crowd. He was walked out to the firing squad and was ruthlessly shot, and his body was then packed away inside of a coffin. But what had this man done which was so bad? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Retribution and vengeance swept throughout France following D-Day. The nation had been subjected to a rough occupation, and many people had been sent to concentration and extermination camps. The German invasion had been swift and quick, and the French signed an armistice with the Nazis. But there were many people who collaborated, and the French collaborationist government in the southern and eastern parts of the country, the Vichy regime, even brought in groups of militia known as the milice to deal with the resistance. Thousands of French people were rounded up by those who had been employed to hunt persecuted people by the Gestapo, and there were also French people who took jobs working alongside the Nazi regime as translators, officials, and in other capacities. Women who were suspected of sleeping with the Germans were later subjected to public humiliation following the liberation, and many of those who were involved in the black market or who had worked with the Nazis were rounded up for trial. Even during the war, there were a number of purges, such as the Operation Sauvage or the Wild Purge, in which people suspected of working with the enemy of the French resistance were dragged out after hastily arranged trials, and they were then executed very quickly. Members of the milice and others who were accused of working with the Nazis were ruthlessly shot in this manner. It's estimated that roughly 4,000 were executed by the resistance, and that's the French resistance's own numbers, and some claim that the number was actually much higher. The US say that roughly 80,000 were executed following the liberation. Many of the executions were photographed and documented by people who witnessed the proceedings, and today these images have lived on in infamy, and they show how the resistance put people to the sword for their actions during World War II. One man who was executed in October 1944 was known as Nitard, and he had been condemned for working for the Germans. One man who witnessed the execution documented what happened, and he picked up the story. He claimed, in October 1944, in the small town of Vienne, France, a French collaborator named Nitard was sentenced to death. He was no large-scale spy, just a man who had been working as a clerk in the German administration, probably for the Gestapo. But one must remember that in the early days of liberation in France, as in any country that had suffered 4 years-long occupation, feelings ran high against any collaborator, big or small. And then, of course, the really dangerous collaborators were not easy to bring to justice, so the small fry had to pay the price for their more fortunate partners in crime. More fuel to the fire had been the executions by the Germans of many great patriots, as in French resistance members, both in Lyon and in Vienne. The outcry was therefore so violent that even though Nitard's appeal to the courts of justice in Grenoble had been successful, the shooting was ordered to take place, so as to not disappoint the population of Vienne. I cannot help feeling, so that everyone in the town should have a chance to watch the execution and share in the general revenge, it was scheduled to take place at noon. 5,000 people, children included, crowded into a square in front of the old military barracks. So intense was the excitement that one could almost smell it, as one can before a bullfight or even a good football game, whilst in the barracks square the condemned man gulped back the traditional glass of rum and lit the traditional cigarette, as in the last drink and last cigarette he would ever have. He puffed at it a few times, then stubbed it out, thrust a butt into his pocket, and went to face the firing squad. He passed through a hall where the 12 rifles, one with a blank cartridge, had been laid out ready, and walked out into the square to be met by a priest, the firing squad, its commanding officer, and the now strangely silent crowd. This demonstration of public justice shocked me profoundly. No one deplored collaboration more than I, but this punishment seemed to me to be out of all proportion to this man's relatively small crime. My nerves were taut. This man who was about to die was so close. I don't remember whether the crowd was silent now or not. Suddenly I felt very close to that man standing alone in the square. The cigarette butt, injustice to humanity, and then the overwhelming feeling that the man was dead already, that he was like a duck with its head cut off that runs for a minute before finally falling dead. He was dead before he even entered the arena. Even after 15 years, I can't stand using that word. The show was reaching its climax, but now the man was untied from the post. He was a traitor, and traitors are not given the right to meet death facing the squad. The seconds ticked by as he was bound with his back to the rifles, and then they fired. Nitard never saw me, although I was at times no more than 5 feet away. It's not known what specifically Nitard, the collaborator, had done specifically, but it is believed that he was one of those French people who collaborated with the Germans and whose actions for the Gestapo may have led to more deaths, execution and torture. He was shot in the back in a final act of disgrace. Lots of people who resisted the German occupation suffered massively at the hands of the Nazi authorities, and the French resistance would try to purge and get rid of these people as quickly and as ruthlessly as they could. In the years after the war, there were more legal executions carried out, as many collaborators were taken in front of courtrooms and judges, and they were tried before they were then shot inside a French forts by a military firing squad, and men who suffered this included the Vichy Prime Minister, Pierre Laval. But the French resistance sought to brutally punish those who were the enemies of them, even during the Second World War, whilst their country was still being liberated. Inside of Vienna that day, many people witnessed the execution of a man who had worked with the Gestapo and the Nazis for some time, and he paid the ultimate price for his collaboration during the war. But what is interesting is that the eyewitness believed he hadn't really done too much, but for the resistance, any small collaboration was enough for them to shoot you. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.